Hi, welcome to the movie on clarity and conciseness. In this movie, I'm going to talk about one of the most important things in terms of building your portfolio score, and that is how clear and how concise your sentences are. If readers can't understand your sentences, if it's difficult for them to read it, that certainly plays a large role in what your portfolio score will ultimately be. So hopefully I can give you a few guidelines here and show you a few things that will beef up the clarity and conciseness in your sentences. One of the first things we need to deal with is wordiness, or just, an excessive amount of words in your sentences. I see this an awful lot in your drafts, and so this is a common thing. The term that it's actually called is a nominalization. And this happens when you're taking something and that could be a verb and you're expressing it as a noun. And that tends to make your sentences very wordy. So if you look at the example, the cause of our school's failure at teaching digital literacy is not understanding the influence it has on learning. The first thing that I would point out to you is this is right here. I mean, right away, that's the main verb in the sentence. Well, the central verb being is doesn't give us much punch, does it? It doesn't really help the reader. It doesn't give them much to work with. I mean, often we have to use this kind of to be verb sometimes, and it sure comes up a lot in writing. But if we can avoid it, we want to do that. So you also see that in addition to that, there's a number of nominalizations in terms of this. Here's the word cause, which it could be a verb, to cause something. Failure, which is to fail. And then here's influence. And then here's also learn, which is also, learn could be a verb. So is there a way that we can turn this around so that we get this, so that instead of it being so wordy, we can have this more concrete, more focused? Well, let's look at the next slide. So you see how we can fix this nominalization. Here's our original sentence again, the one that we've been, dealing with on the other slide. And you can see how wordy it all is. But if we look down at the revised version, well, the first thing that we see is that our school. So here's the subject right away, and it's a much clearer subject, right? Because the cause is subject here, schools. Well, we understand what schools are. Have failed. So right away we see here's the verb. And we've taken that failure and we've turned it into a verb. To teach digital literacy because educators, again, we get a person, a place, a thing, something that the reader can identify, do not understand how it influences learning. Now, we don't lose every nominalization. I mean, we lose some. We still have some issues that we're dealing with in terms of this. But, we got rid of some of them, and we made the sentence clearer as a result of that. So it's not required that you get rid of every nominalization, but try to limit them and try to make verbs a little more active. Keep that in mind. The next thing I want to deal with is prepositional phrases. This is another thing that often makes your sentences long and sometimes cumbersome to read because they just go on for a long time because this string of prepositional phrases that you've got. If we look at this first sentence, it is important for students. So here's a preposition. In today's world, so here's another preposition, of digital literacy, to gain high digital literacy. So here we see we've got a number of prepositional phrases already. And we see also how these become nominalizations like we talked about in the previous slide. Instead of them being active and great verb choices for us, we've got all these phrases that make it more difficult for the reader to understand our prose. And when we look at the revised section, all of a sudden here we have students. So again, we have that strong subject, something that we can, deal with that's concrete for us, for the reader. So that's something that we like right away to see in that example. And students today must attain. So here we've got that as a strong verb, high digital literacy. And also look at how much shorter the sentence is. So right away, it's much easier for the reader to comprehend. So watch out for those prepositional phrases, those sentences where you get a number of those kind of running after one another. as you probably noticed, one of the things that's come up as I've been talking with you about this is this idea of choosing a clear subject and how important that is. I mean, and that we want things that are much more concrete. If we go back to our original example where the subject is the cause of our school's failure, so we have this great, complex subject here. And then when we look at the revision, right away we can say, oh, here's our subject. Well, isn't schools easier to understand than the cause of all our school's failure? That's much more difficult for the reader to take in, but now we get a much more concrete image here. So I think it's much better to go with this sort of clear subject and think about how you can make your subjects clearer. Here's a list of sentence subject guidelines. First of all, clear sentence subjects typically include people, institutions, and events, like we were seeing with our schools there. So you like the idea that there's something that we can really relate to, something that the reader can see as concrete. Make sure that that's what you're working with when you're working with those subjects. Unclear sentence subjects are often treated by the are created by abstractions and processes. It's tempting to use these, and sometimes you have to use an abstraction or a process as the subject for your sentence. But you want to be careful about doing that, and do this in a minimal way whenever you really need to, but not as a regular thing. Another thing that just to keep in mind, subjects belong near the beginning of your sentences. You don't want too many introductory clauses or too many things separating the reader from that subject. And then subjects and verbs should be in close proximity to one another. They shouldn't be far away. Sometimes people will put the subject here and then the verbs way over here. Well, that's a long time for the reader to try to make that connection together. Remember, the subject is acting or doing the acting that the verb describes or informs the reader about. So if they're too far apart, that makes it much more difficult for the reader to understand the sentence. One challenge for students is always this concept of voice, and a lot of times because it's talked about as passive voice, and students will think, well, that means the past tense. And they're thinking about the verb tense and that issue. Well, that's not really the case. Voice is really about the subject of the sentence, and whether the subject of the sentence is speaking to us, speaking to the sentence, and is doing the action, or if the subject's really sort of hiding from us and not in what we would call the subject position, and is in some place where they can kind of not be obvious. And we can see that here when we look at the two examples. So first let's look at the active sentence. So this is an active voice. Students created YouTube video movies to help them revise their essays. So students is the subject of this particular essay, and here is the verb of the essay, and then YouTube movies is what they did. So here this is in the object position, and that's pretty much the standard thing for the sentence. And we say that this is active voice because it's the students taking the action. The subject is taking the action in this. But when we come over here to the passive voice, and you see I've used the same sentence and just moved things around, all of a sudden the object here is now in the subject position. So all of a sudden it's not where we would expect it to be. So YouTube movies, and then you notice this were created. Notice how this sentence structure works. And this may be part of the confusion that students experience, because passive voice is always a grammatical construction. It requires a form of the to be verb and the past tense. Well, were, this part right here is a to be verb, right? So it's just a past tense helper here, and this is certainly past tense. So created is past tense. So this is the reason why students get very confused sometimes, and they think if they're using past tense, that's always passive, but that's not the case, because we see back in our active example, this is past tense, but it's not passive. So here this combination of the to be verb and the past tense of the verb makes this a passive voice. And it ends up that the YouTube movies, which is the object of the sentence, is in that position, and all of a sudden students is ending up in this prepositional phrase here, and that's the person that's doing the action. That is the actor of the sentence. So you can see the actor has been buried, right? He's really in the middle of the sentence where we wouldn't even expect the actor to be, and also the part of the sentence that we pay the least attention to. So you want to be aware of the difference between active and passive voice, and you want to use them thoughtfully. For the most part, we really push students to use active voice. It tends to make the essay livelier and more readable. But sometimes, and in certain situations, passive voice is very appropriate, and you want to use that construction. What's most critical here is that you know the difference, and you make a choice for the one that you want to use. One final activity and one final way to begin to get some of the wordiness out of your sentences and make them more concise. Avoid beginning sentences with expletive constructions. Expletive constructions, you might say. You think I'm talking about dirty words. Well, in this case, I'm really not. Expletive constructions are terms like there is, or there are, or it is, that take up space at the beginning of the sentence. And we often see students use that kind of language. If we look at the original, we can see right here, it is possible that students are unaware of the distractions associated with multitasking. Well, if we're trying to make that sentence more readable and more straightforward for the reader to grasp what it is that they're looking at, we can really take a look at this whole beginning section right here and say, is that a good subject? I mean, first of all, it is. Is that what we really want in the subject position? And what's the it really referring to? Well, wouldn't students make a better subject? And so you can see down here, I've made that change. Students is now in the subject position, and the students are doing the acting, so they're saying they are unaware of the distractions associated with multitasking. All we really did was get rid of all the stuff before that clause. And you can see that after the that clause, we've really got a nice sentence. And it works much better that way. So that's something to look for in terms of your writing. Do you have that kind of an opening to a sentence that you don't really need, that just adds extra words to the sentence, makes it longer, and makes the subject less clear? So try to clean that up as well. One final slide to recap. So when you're revising your sentences, make sure you express actions and verbs, avoid strings of prepositions, choose clear subjects, favor active voice over passive, and avoid beginning sentences with expletive constructions. I hope this has been helpful for you. Again, if you need more assistance with this, don't be shy about coming to me or to one of your peers or hitting the Writing Center. There's still time, and they'll be glad to work with you. Good luck.